Hello, I am Hamid and I am a PhD student at University of Illinois. In this talk I am going to talk about exploring multi-scale interactions in redox flow battery for resilient energy storage. Most of the results and mathematical model I am going to present are taken from this paper that has recently been published. First, the motivation. The motivation is toward, that is renewable energy, and there are few known sources of renewable energy. My interest is mostly on wind energy, especially producing electricity from this wind turbine. And people are doing it, and when they do it they need to install some kind of energy storing device with it, and the reason is the intermittency. So this figure shows the intermittency associated with wind turbine, and also there is an intermittency or uncertainty with the demand of the electricity. So we need to store energy so that we can use the energy when we need it. So we need a large scale energy storage device connected with this wind turbine here. And among other candidates, redox flow battery is a very good candidate because of this true property. And this is the schematic of a redox flow battery. Here we have this reactor here, these are the two tanks, and inside this reactor we have two electrodes separated by a separator or ion exchange membrane, and we have the electrolyte flowing through this tank and the electrode, and there is a chemical reaction going on here producing a redox species or charged species that is being stored inside this tank. So to give an idea about the size of these batteries, here are real photos taken from California 2014, and these white things here and these four white things, big things here, these are actually the tank, and these two small things, those are the reactors, and these are people, so you can get an idea about the length scale. So in detailed, we have different length scale associated here. The first one is obviously the chemical reaction going on in tens of nanometer scale. Then we have this molecular diffusion, then we have electrolyte flow through the pores, then we have this flow field effect, and then we have tank mixing. So our target is to start from this point, and we want to put all effects together to develop a model that can predict the performance of redox flow battery. And there are a lot of models available on in literature, and those models actually take this effect as a boundary condition, this one as a transport mode, and then they actually develop a pore scale model, and that model is incorporated into flow field or macroscopic model by a continuum model, and then people actually take care of the tank mixing by flow dynamics. And those models have two problems. The first problem, when people uses continuum modeling, they use some kind of, or assume some kind of correlation between the production and consumption rate of a species with external flow condition. Yeah, that is actually the Sherwood number and Peclet number. So this correlation, these are actually different experimental data shown here, and you see that these correlations, they actually vary by order of magnitudes. And people uses different kind of correlations based on their choice. So that is one problem. The second problem is the transient effect, and this is actually the effect produced by that fluctuations you already saw. So is that effect important? To answer that question, we compare two time scales. The first one is the characteristics time period of the intermittency, and the second one is the diffusion time scale for a typical redox flow battery. And you see they are in very same order of magnitudes. So yes, these transient effects, they are important. So now we want to develop a model that can actually take care of those two problems. So remember those two problems. The first problem was the transient effect, and the second problem was the correlation between Sherwood number and Peclet number. So in our model, we modeled the porous electrode as a periodic unit, by a periodic unit, that is a unit cell here, and we apply periodic boundary condition across it. So we neglect all concentration gradient across this unit cell, even across this whole electrode. So, but in reality, every redox flow battery that will operate under a macroscopic concentration gradient. So is that assumption valid? To answer that question, we focus on the dynamics of redox flow battery operation, and we have this reactor and tank, and we can write down these two mass conservation equations for tank and reactor. We can get the solution by Laplace transform, and from that solution we say, okay, this reactor operates at this concentration gradient. This is actually the scaled concentration, streamwise concentration gradient, and we compare this concentration gradient with this characteristics transverse concentration gradient. So if this effect is if this concentration gradient is negligible compared to this one, then transient, and then our model is okay. So to compare that, we define a non-dimensional concentration difference and do not focus on these expressions, just focus on this one. So here is two conditions in two different limits of Peclet numbers. The second one is always true. The first one, that actually limits the applicability of a model for a thin electrode. So now the mass transport modes. Mass can transport through these three modes, but we can neglect migration by assuming that enough supporting electrolyte, enough supporting salt is dissolved in the electrolyte. So now we define the conjugate problem. That is actually the real problem we are trying to model. So that problem, we can write down the conservation equation for both species and look at the boundary conditions for those species. The boundary conditions are nonlinear and conjugate and coupled. So this is very, very problematic expressions to solve. So we define the auxiliary problem based on the decomposition of that concentration in two components. The first one is the uniform surface concentration, that is the only function of time, and the second one is time independent contribution to the local concentrations. And this idea was motivated from this figure. And here we see that if we change the surface concentration with time, then we expect at any location the concentration will catch up with the surface concentration, and the difference between these two concentrations will become time independent. If we assume that and we replace in our mass conservation equation, then that equation will turn out to be this form. So the unsteady equation was transformed into a steady equation with a source term, when this source term is basically the rate of change of surface concentration. So now these equations, so we have this conjugate problem here and we have this auxiliary problem here, and you see this auxiliary problem, they are decoupled and they are very easy to solve, all linear and like Dirichlet type boundary conditions. So one may ask, like, okay, how do we ensure that these boundary conditions can fulfill or satisfy these boundary conditions? The answer is this boundary condition is satisfied with this condition and this boundary condition is satisfied with this condition. So these two boundary conditions, mathematically they can actually satisfy these boundary conditions. So after developing that model, we actually solved the model for very simple geometry, that is cylindrical array of cylinders, and for this type of geometry we show the Sherwood number and Peclet number correlation here. Here we see three different regimes and three different types of variation of Sherwood number. So this is actually the output of our model. So our model can give a relation or correlation between Sherwood number and Peclet number depending on the porosity, microstructure of the electrode, and the flow condition of the electrode, flow condition of the battery. So this graph actually tells us, like, okay, power law correlation like people use in their model, upscale model, that actually under and over predict Sherwood number in the limit of low and high Peclet number. So instead of using any power law correlation, we can use our model that will give us this data, and we can use that data for upscaling model to use in upscaling models. So the conclusion, a theory is presented to study the conjugate mass transport, and the two problems that has been taken care in that model, the first problem was the transient effect and the second problem was the power law correlation. Those two problems have been solved in this model. And here is the list of the references, and thank you all.